The courtroom door felt heavier than it should have. I pushed it open in my only good suit, the one I'd bought 3 years ago for job interviews, and hadn't needed since. My palms were dry, but my stomach churned like I'd swallowed a live wire. Inside, they were already seated. My parents in the front row, arms crossed. My older brother, David, next to them, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my rent. All three of them were dressed like they were attending a press conference, not a hearing to strip me of my rights. Mom saw me first. She leaned over and whispered something to Dad. He didn't turn his head, just rolled his eyes. Actually rolled his eyes, like I was a late guest at their dinner party instead of the target of their legal ambush. Their lawyer was across the aisle, shuffling papers with that polished $500 an hour confidence. He didn't even glance at me. The bailiff directed me to the defendant's table, and I sat down without speaking. I opened my briefcase. Inside were 3 folders, color-coded tabs, pages cross-referenced. I didn't have money for a lawyer, but I had time, and I had something they didn't know about yet. Something Grandpa left buried in fine print. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the air was already hostile. I could feel it crawling up my neck, the unspoken belief that I didn't belong here. Not just in this courtroom, but in the family, in the legacy, in the fortune. Let me back up. 6 months ago, my grandfather passed away. He was the only person in my family who ever saw me clearly. While David was being groomed for law school and schmoozing with hedge fund kids, I was flipping burgers, working nights, then enrolling in community college just to prove I wasn't useless. At the will reading, they all assumed David would get the house, maybe the stocks, definitely the trust, but Grandpa gave me the educational trust, an old asset he'd been growing for years. Quiet, long-term investments in ETFs and municipal bonds. What none of them realized was that this little education trust was now worth close to $2.1 million. I remember the look on David's face when the executor said my name. He blinked, like he misheard it. My mom went stiff. My dad chuckled under his breath and said, "That must be a typo," but it wasn't. What followed was weeks of fake smiles, group texts about staying united, and a family meeting that turned into a lecture. They wanted me to sign over control of the trust so it could be pulled into a shared family portfolio. I walked out. That's when the legal letters started. The petition claimed I was financially immature, reckless, emotionally unstable. They said I already started spending the money, which I hadn't. They accused me of lacking the capacity to manage long-term assets. They wanted to install David as trustee. And now, here I was, sitting alone. No lawyer, no allies, just a briefcase full of receipts and something they never bothered to read. The clerk called the room to order. All rise for Judge Elaine Morrison. I stood, hard calm despite everything. Judge Morrison was known for being meticulous, fair, and impressed by theatrics. She looked at me first, then my family. Her face neutral, but sharp. Counsel for the petitioner, present. David's lawyer stood. Richard Bellamy. Your Honor. Respondent. I stepped forward. Your Honor, I'll be representing myself. A faint flicker of surprise crossed her face. My mother turned to David, whispering again. Judge Morrison nodded. Very well, let's begin. I opened the first folder and slid out the initial exhibit. If they thought I'd break down or beg, they were wrong. I wasn't here to defend who I was. I was here to remind them who Grandpa raised me to be. You don't grow up in a family like mine without learning how to be invisible. David was the achiever, the future CEO, the legacy. I was the quiet one, which was just another way of saying I didn't matter unless they needed someone to help set the table or fix the WI-V. Every birthday, holiday, graduation, if there was a spotlight, David was under it. My parents didn't even hide it. When he got into Yale, my mom cried tears of joy. When I got into a local state school on a partial scholarship, she barely looked up from her phone. I wasn't resentful. Not at first. I just assumed it was normal. Some people shine brighter. I thought I was okay being dim. But Grandpa saw me differently. He used to say, David talks big, but you listen sharp. That matters more than you think. He paid attention, asked about my part-time jobs, taught me how to read financial statements, how to look past noise and spot patterns. Every Sunday, we'd sit at his old dining table, sipping tea, and he'd hand me a yellow legal pad with puzzles on it. Not the crossword kind, life puzzles. How would you invest $100 a month for 20 years if inflation's at 3% and growth average is 7? Stuff like that. I didn't realize until later. He was training me. When Grandpa died, the will was read in his attorney's office, a cramped but warm place with heavy books and the scent of pipe tobacco still lingering in the wood. His lawyer, Mr. Greenbaum, was in his late 70s, barely heard a thing, but he was precise. David got the lake house and a chunk of the portfolio. My parents received various assets, jewelry, bonds, property. Then came the last item, the Winston Education Trust, left solely in my name, fully vested, no trustee oversight. David's jaw clenched. Mom stared at me like I'd just stolen her jewelry box. They didn't say anything at first, just silent nods and forced hugs. But a week later, the family meeting was called. It was at our childhood home. The smell of lemon polish and old entitlement hung in the air. They framed it like a discussion, but it was a shakedown. David brought pie charts. Mom brought guilt. Dad brought his "I'm not mad, just disappointed" voice. We think it's best to consolidate all assets into one family-managed trust, David said. School. That was Grandpa's wish, Mom added. He just didn't know how to word it in legal terms. I asked for a copy of the paperwork. There was none. They handed me a printed form to sign, transferring control of my trust to David. I didn't even read it. Just stood up, said no, and left. I got home that night and couldn't sleep. It wasn't just the pressure, it was the realization. I've been too quiet for too long. They didn't just think I was weak, they needed me to be weak. Because for once in their lives, I held something they couldn't control. Weeks passed. Then came the process server. He handed me a thick envelope like it was just another pizza delivery. Inside, a court petition. My parents and brother had filed to have me declared financially incompetent. The grounds? Erratic behavior, lack of financial sophistication, emotional instability due to unresolved grief. They even included a screenshot of a tweet I made joking about burning out from work. Out of context. It looked bad. I felt something crack inside. Not fear, not sadness. Clarity. They were willing to destroy me to get what they wanted. That night, I pulled out the binder Grandpa left me. It was an old leather thing with metal rings and yellowing pages. On the inside cover, he'd written, "Read everything, especially the boring stuff." I flipped through articles, handwritten notes, trust instructions. Then I saw it, a paragraph buried on page 43 of the original trust declaration. Clause 17b, forfeiture by interference. It stated that any attempt by family members to seize, co-manage, or alter the terms of the trust without the named beneficiary's consent would result in full forfeiture of their own inheritance. I read it 5 times to be sure. It was enforceable. It was ironclad, and it was signed. The next morning, I called the only person I trusted with it, Jake, my college roommate. He just passed the bar, young, hungry, and brilliant. He read the clause and whistled. This is a nuke. We got to work. Jake and I didn't waste time. He drafted a formal letter to their attorney within 48 hours, citing clause 17b in bold, underlined font. It wasn't a threat, it was a guarantee. If they didn't withdraw the petition immediately, they would forfeit every dollar Grandpa had left them. The silence that followed was eerie. 3 days later, their response came not a withdrawal, but an escalation. They claimed Grandpa was manipulated in his final days, that I had undue influence over an elderly man, and that the clause itself was inserted fraudulently. The insult hit deeper than I expected. They were accusing me of rewriting a man's legacy, a man who raised me with more love and guidance than they ever did. But I didn't lash out. I gathered proof. We subpoenaed email records, notarization logs, timestamps, and then something broke open. Jake called me at midnight. Voice urgent. They forged an amendment. He forwarded a scan, a document dated 2 weeks before Grandpa's death, supposedly adjusting the trust to unify control under David for family harmony. It was fake. Wrong seal. Wrong font. Grandpa's signature didn't match. Worst of all, the notary listed on the form had retired a year earlier. It was sloppy, desperate, and illegal. We tracked down the real notary, Mrs. Klein. She remembered Grandpa clearly. She confirmed she never notarized that amendment and gave a written, sworn statement to prove it. Jake brought in a forensic document analyst. The results were damning. Not just falsification, but provable fraud. Meanwhile, David was unraveling in his own way. Through a friend, I learned his fintech startup had collapsed. Millions lost. Our parents were hemorrhaging money trying to bail him out. The country house had quietly gone into foreclosure. The whole petition wasn't about family concern, it was survival. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt tired, sad. They hadn't just tried to steal from me. They collapsed under their own ambition, and I just happened to be in the way. So I gave Jake one final instruction: file a counter-petition for fraud, breach of trust, and malicious defamation. The court date came fast. I wore the same suit. My hands weren't shaking this time. When the judge entered, the air felt different, sharper. Everyone sensed what was coming, even if they didn't know the shape of it yet. Is the respondent represented by counsel? Judge Morrison asked. Jake stood up halfway, but I touched his arm and stood myself. I am, Your Honor. A ripple moved through the courtroom. My parents looked at each other. David's lips parted like he wanted to object, but I was already walking to the front. I laid out everything, calm, precise. I showed the clause, the notarized originals, the forensic report, the notary's affidavit. Then I dropped the forged document last. You don't just betray a will, I said. You betray a man's final trust in his family. Silence. Judge Morrison's face didn't move an inch, but her ruling came clear and fast. Petition denied. Clause 17B enforced. The estate distribution was irrevocably frozen. My family's inheritances were stripped due to breach of trust and fraud. Sanctions were issued against their attorney. Jake shook my hand in the hallway afterward. You burned the house down. No, I said. I just locked the door they tried to sneak through. 30 days passed. The assets were redistributed. I kept the trust. And touched. I used part of it to start a scholarship fund in Grandpa's name for first-generation students studying finance. I still get emails from my mother. Polite ones, shallow ones. Hope you're well. Thinking of you. Let's talk. But I don't reply. Not out of spite. Out of peace. I answer the phone when they call, maybe once every few months. I keep conversations short, civil, bounded. No holidays, no shared accounts, no shared decisions. You don't owe people access just because you share. Vlad, I didn't win to punish them. I won to protect what was mine. And to honor the man who taught me how to listen, sharply even when the room was screaming at me to stay quiet.